Following in the footsteps of greatness is never an easy thing, especially at the dawn of history. This was the Bronze Age, when glory could not be bought or borrowed or bartered, except with the price of blood. Sure, there was praise to be earned for building roads and consecrating temples and giving grain to the hungry. All of that was very well and good. However, it was the virtues of war, not peace, that enabled a man to be great. Tragically, there was no other playbook, only the one written by Sargon in the blood of his enemies. And his successors, knowing no other way, followed it to the very letter, even as it became certain that their creation could never last. The year was 2279 BC, or thereabouts, and Sargon of Akkad was dead after a reign of 56 years. He was succeeded by his son, Roux, whose ascension was accompanied with the outbreak of rebellion. Despite the many uprisings his father had put down, resistance to Akkadian hegemony was evidently reinvigorated by what the Sumerians perceived to be a moment of weakness. Now, with Sargon out of the picture, the Sumerians reasoned that they had a chance to break free of the Akkadian yoke, disenchanted as they were with rendering tribute to Akkad in the form of grain and other commodities. Even if the Akkadian Empire was fundamentally decentralized in nature, and willing to co-opt those born outside of Akkad into the inner circle, there were probably other reasons for Sumerian discontent beyond the extraction of tribute, including the dispossession of land first from small Sumerian landlords and later the Ensees, the ostentatiousness of a newly ascendant Akkadian aristocracy, and finally the embitterment that any sophisticated civilization might feel in a state of subjugation. But however legitimate these misgivings were, Sumerian resistance was summarily crushed by Roux and his armies. The Sumerian cities of Umma, Lagash, Adab, Dare, and Kezulu were all brought to heel once again. After all these millennia, we still have the cold, clinical casualty counts of these reconquests, carefully recorded in cuneiform inscriptions by the scribes of Roux. In all, something like 23,000 Sumerians were supposed to have been killed in battle, with twice that number being taken captive. A staggeringly large portion of the fighting men of Sumer had suddenly been neutralized, and it was the fighting men who fared the worst, sentenced to death, slavery, or a lifetime of hard labor, such as stone cutting in the distant Zagros Mountains in present-day Iran. In a further act of reprisal, Roux seized some 134,000 hectares of farmland outside of Lagash and Umma. That's about 331,000 acres, or the equivalent of 250,000 football fields, making this the largest land transaction, if it can be called such, that is documented in Mesopotamian history. These vast swathes of land were entrusted to the royal favorites that formed the core of the Akkadian elite, allowing Roux to consolidate his control of the region and turn his attention elsewhere. Roux proceeded to squash resistance around Akkad in the very heartland of his empire before going on the offensive against Elam in the east. He was successful yet again, reasserting Akkadian control in Elam and Susiana and returning with even more plunder and slaves. We have a depiction of one such unfortunate slave, portrayed as naked, bound, and hauled forward by a nose ring attached to what seems to be a pole. To celebrate his successes, we hear that Roux had a statue made of himself in tin, a rare and therefore immensely valuable metal in the region, which could be alloyed with copper to form bronze. We know this by way of an inscription associated with the statue that equated Roux with the gods, something unprecedented at the time. Curiously, we have another work from this period called Head of a Ruler. Simply named but intricately carved, its original name and subject elude us. Made of a copper alloy, it may depict Rimouche, although we lack the evidence to confirm this. Personally, looking at this individualized, life-sized copper head, with its intelligent brow, heavy-lidded eyes, and delicate mouth, I find it difficult to believe that Rimouche would have himself depicted this way. Although only hollows remain where eyes should be, there is a kindness and refinement that emanates from this face that does not accord with the historical image we have of Rimouche, the one he spent the 9 years of his reign cultivating with lengthy recitations of the number of enemy dead, captured, and enslaved. But perhaps there was simply another side to the man. That would not make him the only butcher in history with a sensitive side. Far from it, in fact. Whatever the case, after almost a decade of rule, Rimouche met his end in a dramatic palace conspiracy. As Mesopotamian tradition has it, he was killed not by dagger, sword, or bow, but instead by a group of courtiers armed with cylinder seals, the very instruments meant to legitimize his decrees. The mechanics of the murder are a mystery to us. Rimouche was either beaten to death, strangled to death with the cords from which cylinder seals could be suspended, as if on a lanyard, or stabbed to death with the pins that cylinder seals could be attached to cloaks with. One wonders whether Rimouche's brother, Manishtusu, was involved in the conspiracy, for it was he that now ascended to the blood-spattered Akkadian throne. Manishtusu inaugurated his reign by pushing even further east than his brother had, beyond Susa, to seize Anshan and Shirihum. We are also told that he assembled a mighty fleet and conquered 32 cities beyond the sea, those that speckled the Persian Gulf coast. In taking these lands, Manishtusu secured for his empire a fresh supply of silver as well as diorite, a precious stone that breathed new life into the art of Akkadian sculpture, which became increasingly naturalistic, grandiose, and tailored to royal and funerary themes. Beyond that, we know that Manishtusu established new trade routes, most notably with the faraway civilization of Egypt. And, closer to home, he rebuilt the Temple of Ishtar in Nineveh. In total, Manishtusu ruled for 15 years. It was a longer reign than his predecessors, and seemingly more peaceful, judging by the lack of inscriptions and other such commemorations related to military conquests. But it ended in almost exactly the same way as his brother's reign did, with a palace conspiracy that left Manishtusu slain at the hands of his own courtiers. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Naram-Sin, who had been groomed for command while accompanying his father during his military campaigns. Supposedly, he was also a great hunter, felling a wild bull in Syria. Of all of Sargon's successors, Naram-Sin would be the greatest without question, the only one who could rival him in martial prowess and fame. During Naram-Sin's 37-year reign, the Akkadian Empire reached its territorial zenith, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and encompassing parts of present-day Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Syria, and Turkey, with influence in modern Oman, Pakistan, Lebanon, and other regions that either paid tribute or traded with the Akkadians. In his day, Naram-Sin would come to be known as King of the Four Quarters of the Earth, the first Sargonic ruler to take this title. Anticipating the triumphs held by the Romans, it was during the reign of Naram-Sin that all sorts of exotic animals entered the record of Mesopotamia, appearing in art, literature, and inscriptions. Suddenly, we hear of elephants, rhinos, crocodiles, water buffaloes, gazelles, and lions. Of particular importance, as one might expect, is the lion, the king of the jungle, who would become associated with Naram-Sin, depicted as he was seated on a leonine throne or mount. As with Sargon, precious little remains about the means by which Naram-Sin won his battles, but we have a lengthy accounting of the lands he took and the enemies he killed and humiliated, with precise figures given, as was the case with his immediate predecessors, Roux and Manishtusu. But Naram-Sin was in a league of his own, or at the very least, in the same one as Sargon. Like Anzu, the mythical lion-headed stormbird of Mesopotamian tradition, we see Naram-Sin flying from one corner of his ever-expanding empire to the other, from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the Taurus and Amanus Mountains in the west, to the Armenian highlands in the north where he reached the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, the life-giving rivers of Mesopotamia that had made all of it possible, cities, civilization, and the rest of it. As we have established, our grasp on many specificities related to this period is tenuous, and we don't always know whether a given region was firmly under Akkadian control or merely a tributary. We often hear about reconquests, with peripheral regions seeming to have passed in and out of Akkadian control quite often. Nonetheless, even if some of Naram-Sin's conquests were really reconquests, others indicate that he succeeded where his predecessors failed, or at the very least, that he is perceived to have done so. Regarding Naram-Sin's conquests in Syria, for example, we have the following inscription. Quote, "Whereas for all time since the creation of mankind, no king whosoever had destroyed Armanum and Ebla, the god Nergal, by means of his weapons, opened the way for Naram-Sin the Mighty, and gave him Armanum and Ebla. Further, he gave to him the Amanus, the Cedar Mountain, and the Upper Sea, by means of the weapons of the god Dagon, who magnifies his kingship. Naram-Sin the Mighty conquered Armanum and Ebla." End quote. In this inscription, we meet two gods that we have not yet crossed paths with. The first is Nergal, god of the underworld and associated with destruction. And the second is Dagon, the god associated with prosperity. One could say that these two deities embodied Naram-Sin's reign well, destruction on the one hand and prosperity on the other. As regards the conquests themselves, though, there is some debate over the historicity of Naram-Sin's claims. Some scholars think that Ebla had already been destroyed by Sargon, or even before that, in 2500 BC, over 150 years before the start of Sargon's reign. Unlike Ebla, we do not even know where Armanum was located. We are told, however, that it had 3 thick layers of wall surrounding it, but that these were overcome by Naram-Sin and his armies, who captured the ruler of the city after a tense standoff in the doorway of his palace. Supposedly, the outer wall stood 20 cubits high, or a little over 13 feet, the inner wall 30 cubits high, or 20 feet, and the citadel wall 44 cubits high, or a little over 29 feet. These were still the early days of walled fortifications, and so it is in this regard perhaps, as a master of the nascent art of siege warfare, that we can consider Naram-Sin a trailblazer. But, as with Sargon, we have none of the tricks of the trade, nothing like the detailed exploits of Alexander at the siege of Tyre, for example. And because, again, these were the early days of siege warfare, the concept of defending a walled fortification was made out to be cowardly in Mesopotamian tradition, with a later poem likening Naram-Sin to a lion snuffing out a fox hidden in his burrow. But this would be far from Naram-Sin's most dramatic showdown. The climax of his reign would come after yet another rebellion broke out in Sumer, one that required him to raise his armies 9 times in a single year. This time, it was precipitated by Kish and Uruk, both of which sought the support of neighboring cities and peoples and formed coalitions that proved to be existential threats to the Akkadian Empire. Undeterred, Naram-Sin's response was to close the gates of Akkad, entreat Shamash, the solar god of justice, rally his army, and then sally out to meet the Kishites and their allies in battle. He emerged victorious and destroyed the remnants of the enemy army in Kish, where the defenders put up a bitter resistance, fighting street by street until the Euphrates, diverted in its course to flood the city, ran red with their blood. Next, Naram-Sin fixed his attention on Uruk, who had allied with the Amorite tribe. In rapid succession, he bested the Amorites and then marched on Uruk itself. Like Kish, Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, which had given the Akkadians so many gifts of civilization, was flooded. Both Kish and Uruk would recover, but the Sumerians had learned their lesson, at least for the moment. Naram-Sin was not to be challenged. Following his victory over the Sumerian coalition, Naram-Sin plundered the cities along the Gulf before returning home laden with booty and with his rebellion subjects clapped in neck stocks. An inscription commemorating the victory read, quote, "Naram-Sin the Mighty, king of Akkad, when the four quarters of the earth attacked him together, through the love Ishtar bore him, was victorious in 9 battles in a single year, and captured the kings whom they had raised up against him. Because he defended his city in crisis, the people of his city asked of him that he be god of their city Akkad, and they built his temple there." End quote. That's right, Naram-Sin had ascended to godhood. In a victory stele commemorating his victory over a Zagros mountain tribe, he is rendered as one, standing at twice the height of those around him, and wearing a horned helmet such as only divine figures were represented with in art and literature. But between the countless battles and the ascension to divine heights, at least in the imagination of his followers, Naram-Sin undertook a series of administrative reforms and civic projects, proving himself Sargon's equal not just in war, but also in stewardship. We can assume that much of these reforms were actually put into effect by the Shapirim, an Akkadian word with no Sumerian equivalent for the steward of the royal court. The Shapirim's second was the land registrar, whose team of scribes helped him keep an accurate record for the total amount of arable land in the empire. In studying the dynamic between the Shapirim, the land registrar, and the ensies, one observes a precocious sort of state formation taking place. Baby steps on the road to the IRS, I guess you could say. Cities in Sumer and elsewhere now had to convert their agricultural output into a new Akkadian standard of measure when rendering tribute, coinciding with an attempt to make the system of weights and measures uniform in the Akkadian Empire. In addition, local administrators had to abide by certain Akkadian mathematical conventions, such as giving a figure for the amount of land that could be cultivated by one team of farmers. There were also new standards imposed on scribes engaged in record keeping, at least for those records submitted to Naram-Sin's court. Everything from the clay tablets they used to the cuneiform script itself had to meet the strict expectations of Akkadian officials, who demanded rectilinear clay surfaces, elegant and broad handwriting, simple and straightforward accounting, and enough space for independent auditors to make their own reports. Looking at the surviving records, one almost feels the need to applaud the Akkadians for making an art out of ledger keeping. As regards civic projects, Akkadian buildings and commodities dating back to this time show up in the archaeological record of the site of Susa and present-day Syria. Furthermore, Naram-Sin had the Sumerian city of Akkad renovated, and we have a document that describes what life was like for the laborers involved in this enterprise, which was overseen by Naram-Sin's eventual successor, Shar-Kali-Shari, under whose reign the project most likely reached fruition. From this document, we hear of the purchase of bronze, copper, silver, and gold weighing tons, and the involvement of 77 woodworkers, 86 goldsmiths, 10 sculptors, and 54 carpenters. We also get a description of what the finished product was supposed to look like. There were to be 4 bisons plated in gold, and 2 winged dragons made of copper, their bare teeth also plated in gold. To me, this iconography sounds like something plucked right out of an Assyrian courtroom. Clearly, the Akkadians set a warlike precedent for these later empire builders, whose infamy would surpass even theirs. To maintain control of the temple system, Naram-Sin appointed not 1, but 3 of his daughters high priestesses. The most notable of these was En-Menana, who was made the direct successor of En-Heduanna as high priestess of As we have discussed before, this temple was dedicated to the deity associated with the moon, known as Nana in Sumerian and Sin in Akkadian. Therefore, it had particular importance to Naram-Sin, whose name meant beloved of the moon god Sin. Another deity of particular importance was, of course, Ishtar. Temples dedicated to this patron deity of the Sargonic dynasty were erected at Nineveh, Zabala, Adab, and the capital, Agade. This brings us to an interesting aspect of Naram-Sin's legacy. Despite his successes on and off the battlefield, and his commitment to erecting temples to please the gods, later civilizations like the Hittites and Babylonians would repeatedly attempt to undermine his legacy, making him out to be a sort of foil to Sargon, disfavored by the gods. Much of this infamy seems to come from one story, the Curse of Akkad, written only about a century after Naram-Sin's reign. The myth seems to have clear parallels to the Sumerian Sargon legend, with Naram-Sin cast in the role of his grandfather's nemesis, Ur-Zababa, the king of Kish who Sargon had been cupbearer to. As far as we can tell, the basis for the legend was Naram-Sin's renovation of the Temple of Akkad in Nippur, which was seen as sacrilegious. Like the Sargon legend, the Curse of Akkad was just a story, but it's honestly a much better one. It's got pace and rhythm and erudition, all the elements of a successful historiographical myth. Not only is it replete with allusions to the origin story of Sargon, it also demonstrates a familiarity with the norms of Akkadian governance and understanding of what life was like for the subjects of the empire. And that is to say nothing about the poem's underlying themes, like the cyclical nature of history, the folly of pride, and the loneliness of kings. We are fortunate to have much of the legend remain intact today, and it is regularly quoted by scholars studying the Akkadian Empire in a wide range of contexts. It's simply one of the best sources we have for understanding the legacy of the Akkadians, colored as it was by the bias of the Sumerian poet-historian who composed it. To me, there is little wonder why this story became almost as cherished as the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamian tradition. It is the first story we have about the fall of an empire, the first of many, and it is well told. But now, let us close this episode with a brief investigation into how the empire actually fell. With the death of Naram-Sin, his son, Shar-Kali-Shari, who had overseen the ill-fated Akkad renovation project, succeeded him. Interestingly, it was during Shar-Kali-Shari's 25-year reign that we hear mention of a city called Babylon for the first time, the cradle of a future empire, which may have been conceived in part due to the decline of nearby Kish. Other cities in the region were also said to be on the decline, possibly because of changing climatic conditions, the same reason given for the decline of Uruk way back in the 4th millennium BC. According to recent scholarship, there is some evidence to suggest that the region around the Khabur River, a northern tributary of the Euphrates, experienced Dust Bowl-like conditions. Downstream, Sumer may have felt the effects of this phenomenon, although not as keenly. More likely, Sumer had been much more impacted by the ceaseless demand for tribute over the course of 2 centuries of Akkadian rule, as evidenced by the repeated rebellions which had but few lapses. On top of the chronically discontented Sumerian cities, Shar-Kali-Shari also faced a new threat, the Gudians, the prototypical barbaric tribe come from the east to wreak havoc. These were the same mountain people referenced in the Curse of Akkad, unleashed by Enlil to plunder and pillage the fracturing Akkadian Empire. Not much is known of them, and they may have appeared on the scene even at the end of Naram-Sin's reign, although Shar-Kali-Shari is said to have won victories against the Gudians, as well as the Amorites, Elamites, and rebellious Sumerians. By the end of his reign, the Akkadian Empire seems to have unraveled. The details of it all are disappointingly murky, with few inscriptions remaining, but the Sumerian king list makes the chaos of the period all too clear, pointedly asking, who was king? Who was not king? After Shar-Kali-Shari, there came 2 other Akkadian rulers that we know of, Dudu, who ruled for 21 years, and his son Shu-Durul, who ruled for 15. But both of them seem only to have reigned over the region of Akkad, with the people of Gudium, Lagash, Umma, Uruk, and Elam picking apart the scraps of the empire like carrion crows. So then, what can we say about the legacy of this earliest of empires? According to some historians, the Akkadian Empire ushered in the heroic chapter of the Bronze Age period, giving the world Gilgamesh-like figures in the form of Sargon and Naram-Sin, who were more grounded in history. Whereas Sargon succeeded in taking a tribal people and conquering the most sophisticated civilization in the known world, Naram-Sin took the Sumerian civilizing mission further still and proclaimed himself a god. The Sumerian king list had already conceptualized the idea of a universal kingship, but the Akkadians actually brought it to life, despite the fact that ancient Sumer never quite accepted its rule. In conclusion, it was a mixed legacy, a decentralized tributary empire that set new precedents and reached new horizons, although at the meticulously recorded cost of human life and dignity, especially among the Sumerians, without whom there was no foundation for this empire. Little wonder then that we hear of Akkadian sculptures being mutilated, despite the futile warnings expressed in their inscriptions. In Assyria, depicted figures had their eyes gouged out, their ears cut, or their heads beheaded, while in Sumer, these figures were habitually smashed into countless pieces. And yet, on the other side of the token, we also hear of worshippers at a temple in Sippar, in the very heart of Mesopotamia, leaving behind offerings to a likeness of Sargon of Akkad. Not only that, we hear of not one, but 2 Assyrian rulers who would take the name Sargon, and we see Nabonidus and Hammurabi of the Babylonians, and Hattusiliu of the Hittites, making favorable references to Akkadian achievements, even as they sought to surpass them. Closer to home, the Sumerian city-states that re-emerged in the wake of the Akkadians, like Lagash, Uruk, and Ur, would emulate the aesthetics and rhetoric of their former subjugator, and build on their civic reforms, as in the case of Shulgi, even if they failed to create empires of their own. In sum, the Akkadians, our prototypical empire builders, would be studied, imitated, worshipped, resented, and caricatured long into the future by succeeding Mesopotamian civilizations right up to the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. But most importantly, they would not be forgotten.
The destinies of heaven and earth had been fixed. The monster of chaos that was the raging waters had been stilled.